confusion. If there are any of you who think that Kenneth Frampton is lecturing here tonight, that's a mistake. Obviously, you know, this is not Kenneth Frampton. It's my great pleasure to welcome Peter Call to the AA. Peter is really no stranger to the AA. He's been an examiner at the school probably for something like 7 years, has been the head of the examiners, and it really is an honor that he's back. Tonight's talk is by way of an introduction to a series of seminars that he is going to be running in the Graduate History and Theory program. I think the first of which starts Thursday.
Not this Thursday, next Thursday.
The Thursday of next week.
At least that's what they said on the phone this morning. I don't know.
Yes. Thursday of next week. So just before the lecture, we were talking about what Peter has been up to during the last few years, and he mentioned that he's been doing research on research. And one of the things that I think we all know about, especially from the context of American schools, is that many academics are spending more and more time doing research, and in fact it's teaching doesn't really have as much value as doing research. So most teachers try to find the maximum amount of time possible to do more and more research, to a point where the whole kind of legitimization of teaching becomes the research. But the irony is that the kind of research that people do in architecture also hasn't really been discussed, because it begins to get more and more away from the relationship between education and practice, from the way that teaching itself is done, and so on and so forth. So for me, I think it's interesting that Peter is focusing on this issue of what is the nature of research, and the fact that a lot of what he is working on and has been working on for the last few years has very much a connection to the whole problem of ethics in relation to architectural research and architectural education. Anyway, Peter Call is a graduate of Princeton University, and after his graduation taught at University of Kentucky, and then received the Rome Prize and spent a year or two, I think, in Rome doing more research. I think, if I remember correctly from those years, his graduate program, his graduate thesis was something related to a cenotaph for James Joyce. Is that right? Yes, a cenotaph for James Joyce, which I heard was, and I saw this particular project, was a fantastic project, and I don't mean to embarrass him, but it was known at Princeton, where he graduated, that his work had been something like the best work in 10 years that was done in the school. So he came to England after Princeton and Kentucky to teach at the AA, where it was fantastic for me to be teaching with him. It was my first year of teaching with Peter and Dalibor Vesely. And then since that time, he's been teaching at Cambridge. So he's been teaching there for some 17 years. Over the last few years, he has been focusing his work specifically on the projects of Le Corbusier, and more specifically, the role of Ronchamp in the work of Corbusier. What we are about to hear tonight has some bearing on this work that Peter has been doing. Would you please join me in welcoming Peter Call?
Well, that was an extraordinary, luscious introduction. I think the last time Moisen introduced me was about 2,500 miles away, and about 5 years ago. And it's, I must confess I value my dialogues with Moisen, and certainly my dialogues with the AA. So it's very nice that you all came in the cold. I hope it's worth it. Do I do lights? Or is... Right. Right, so that is left and right. Moisen touched on a problem that I think has quite wide implications. The simple form of it is that what we do as architects, I mean, in Cambridge, for example, where I teach, architecture, like many places, sits very anomalously between the sciences and the humanities, and it's funded by one and administrated by the other. And the whole university is split between sciences and humanities. And in the new climate of regulated research, quite what the questions are tends to get obscured. And quite what we do if we were left to our own devices is more the kind of problem that I want to look at here, and how particularly the post-war scene has affected the way we think about architecture and the kinds of involvement with courses like architecture and philosophy, architecture and history, architecture and psychology, quite what all of this is about. I'm taking the philosophical dog, let's just get going rather than do a lot of background. And, oh yes, one reason I am putting this up here is because there's one issue that I would like to bear in mind through the rest of this, and that's the difference between right and wrong, i.e. the kinds of things that we can make, we can specify as something we're not to do or not to do, and good and evil, which is a much larger issue, and a much, the difference, the first is about morals, the second is about ethics. The first is about visible goods, the second is about invisible goods, and requires a very different discourse, and the relation between them has been very obscured, both in the side of the humanities and in the side of the sciences. And I'm not going to, you perhaps recognize the fellow on the right. I'd rather, I think, just get going. Whoops, that was a very short lecture. Thank you very much. You can go back in the cold. Right, the dog in question. Le Corbusier actually has a very specific dog in mind. It's this, and we're talking about this section of the iconostase. Everybody know what this thing is? I mean, do we need, no? Just say so if you don't. Right, this is from a poem that he wrote, a poem to the right angle. He wrote an article on the right angle during the years of Esprit Nouveau. He came back and wrote a poem about the right angle, and it's actually the most comprehensive account of what architecture meant to him. Now, what else it was is a bit of a question. The thing is about 155 pages long, and it's a mixture of written text, drawn images, and plates. And this, for example, is one of the plates, and it's that one. So there's 19 of these plates arranged as a tree. There's a little sketch that shows this thing going from earth to heaven, and you're meant to kind of ascend and descend it. In other words, the thing is presented twice, once as a linear text that you follow as a poem, and twice as the simultaneity of images, kind of like a geometric or tarot deck. And of course, a lot of what Le Corbusier does is laid out as a grid of this kind, where you kind of, and the thing is structured from the edges in, and particularly in the 7 layers vertically. Now, this particular one was added last. He's got names for each of these. Roughly what's going on is he's involved with nature and the coincidence of opposites at the top, architecture and proportions in the next layer, a thing he calls flesh at the 3rd level, which is about metamorphosis, and there's a long double story about relations with women and relations with others. It climaxes in this image, which, if you've gone through the paintings, you discover is about his wife, and the painting he calls icon, so the iconostasis. The iconostasis in a Greek church is the screen of icons that screens the high altar. Coming down then finally to his sign of the angle droit, which is actually right angle, which is in fact a summary of the rest of it. And this thing is black, and there's this bit of a square, bit of a circle with a cross in it made by himself, and male, female, angle droit, and it goes on in this sort of way. And this was the last one that he put in. And it, of course, sets up a right angle below the rest of this structure. So I suppose one last word. It goes from a kind of what he calls milieu, or a sort of cosmological structure at the top, to this individual moment at the bottom and then kind of back again. In this image, it's where the most explicitly alchemical moment in it. Part of the text says, "Tolerate the alchemies" in English. And it's got this strange bird figure who you see here, who you probably know from the Pavillon Suisse wall. There she's horizontal, protected by his hand. And she's then descending, and here she's just represented more generally, and here it's quite specific. She's in the bond between this male-female person. And they're on a red bed below the horizon from which this child has come. Right, it's all a pretty lurid little story. Now, part of this child, it goes along with a text in the poem where he talks about being pregnant with the building, or to create architecture is to create a creature. And a lot of the male-female, relationships in here, there's a kind of oppositional, he says back to back, right, get it right, Peter, relationship to Yvonne, his wife. In others, it's a much more complicated affair, and running all through this is a complicated allusion to the Theseus story in the Minotaur, involving Hippolytus, Medea, and it's a founding myth of Western culture, so on and so forth. And in this sense, who this creature is quite difficult to figure out. I mean, he's very, very silent about her. In French, it's la licorne, the unicorn, therefore feminine, but of course unicorns are generally masculine. My view is that she's something like this, because what he speaks of these figures as his bestiary, and this figure is clearly somebody he knew, as well as this more representative figure. And there's a few lines from Brechtel's Nadja that seem to me to give the essence of who this creature is. I've taken Nadja from, Breton writes this in the first person, I've taken Nadja from the first day to the last for a free genius, something like one of the, gosh, there's so much electronics here, I can't deal with myself. The first day to the last for a free genius, something like one of those spirits of the air which certain magical practices momentarily permit us to entertain, but which we can never overcome. Right, so we've got her up in the air, fantastic creature. Then he says, as for her, I know that in every sense of the word she takes me for a god. She thinks of me as the sun. That's actually a fairly accurate summary of the way that woman plays in his iconography, both person and, of course, this was something that every artist did, but Picasso particularly. And it's what I'm going to build up is a whole series of surrogates that Le Corbusier is working with to deal with the kind of world that he has as an artist and the world that he's in and he's working with. No, wrong one. Backwards. Right, now I've got it. Now this just to show you that it's something quite familiar from the alchemical operation, which of course is only on the surface about chemicals. It's actually about the redemption of matter and ultimately of the adept, and it goes through a whole series of cycles, usually 7, told in allegorical language. I don't want to get too caught up in that. Now, in the Fondation is a collection of Le Corbusier's sketches, and this is one of the sketches. And what you see is what I take to be Yvonne, half of Yvonne on one side of the bed, and half of Boo on the other side of the bed, and in the middle is the rolled-up dog. And fortunately, it says reproduction interdit across it, which is absolutely appropriate. Because, of course, they didn't create the creatures that were created with the architecture, not children. And so part of the issue of this dog is that it's a surrogate child. He named the dog Pinceau, meaning paintbrush. Now, whether he knew this, I don't know. This is a little Celtic carving about this big, but it was in the Saint-Baume Museum. You of course did the project prior to Longchamp, the liturgical project prior to Longchamp. It was this great cave at Saint-Baume, and there's this happy little child with a dog curled up on the bottom. But be that as it may, the section, sorry, oh dear. This I should have pointed out. These things are labeled A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Section C1 is a section where Pinceau is most, features most prominently. Right. And the image for that is this thing. The text speaks, he sort of moves from the first person into the dog. Yeah, well, let's not get carried away with that. It was a grammatical error, I agree, but you get the point. And you use phrases like armed, senses alert, this is the hunt, armed to the teeth, muzzle, and I think that is, yes, muzzle and nose, we're off to war, Beelzebub, who is Beelzebub. So this dog is kind of faintly allied with Beelzebub. Here, of course, he's not presented as very volatile, as this peaceful little, pooch lying on the ground. Oh dear, we seem to have eaten a slide. That's back one. Can we do it again? Yeah, thanks. Now, what he also talks about is the elements of a vision are summoned together. The stump of wood, the pebble, the ox and plow. By redrawing and redrawing, they become a bull. Now, this is one story, therefore. There's two stories about where the bull came from, and this is one of them. And to equip its force with scent, here is the dog alert, 8 years on from when the dog got nasty and he had to kill him. That is to say, the dog attacked Vaughan at a dinner, and I guess even knocked the cat over. So we have this lugubrious little family tale, this dog and Le Corbusier bristling for the hunt, which I suppose is appropriate for a dog. But of course, this is a dog that's hunting for metaphors, and the whole point of the bull is this metamorphosis, where the log and the pebble become something else, and of course, it preoccupied him for most of the latter part of his work. Similarly, this iconography of the battle and the hunt. I should also mention that after poor little Pinceau had went nuts and he had to be put down, it appears that his most visible part, his hide, was kept and was used to cover one of Le Corbusier's 2 copies of Don Quixote. And if you ever go to the Fondation, I urge you to avoid that copy of Don Quixote. I'm not bothered by asthma and so forth, but that is a very strong book. My eyes watered, I was coughing, and it's this horrible dog around Don Quixote. But the point, of course, is that the hunting dog, the dog is this kind of Sancho Panza. Le Corbusier identified himself with Don Quixote several times in the latter part of his life. And so you're beginning to see the kind of world that Le Corbusier is building up. Now, it has a precedent in this sort of thing. And that's a self-portrait of Heinrich Kunrat, who wrote a book whose title begins Amphitheater of Eternal Knowledge. People don't write books like that anymore. And of course, here's the friendly pooch helping him through his troubles. And the whole arrangement, the relationship to the gods, the relationship to productivity, the kinds of knowledge that are involved. And of course, this thing not only inspired Borromini, but inspired Le Corbusier. This thing is a lab-oratory, i.e. it's both an alchemical laboratory and an oratory for praying, i.e. a sacred tent and a hearth fire with the music in the middle. And just to quickly show you how that relates to what Le Corbusier is up to. First of all, the building is both tent and cave, and therefore both the prayer side of that circle and the hearth side of that. Whoops, sorry. And I think I some years ago showed you these two things. This is a painting from about 1930. He begins in his work. You see this hermetic stuff appear very visibly about in the late 20s. I mean, for example, it's on the floor of the Palace of the Soviets and so on and so forth. And then it vanishes and begins to come back slowly in the post-war period. So this is a painting called The Lines of the Hand. He was very much into chiromancy. And you've got little planetary symbols on his hand. This thing is red. There's a bark that's part of a play on a book that has to do with both leaves of bark. I can't remember, the famous 15th century alchemist in Paris had a book that he got in Spain that was written on bark. And of course, Le Corbusier's involvement with the tree. This is his matchbook, i.e. the light, the clear ordered light above and the perspectival shadow below. And this thing is actually a hearth. So this red hand then gets sculpted by his friend about 30 years later. And a hearth has been reduced to this kind of wall. The hand has become much more like a fire. The matchbook has become a kind of carved shadow. The bark is simply a shape. And he calls it La Cathédrale. Now, what all of that's given to him in one passage of Rabelais, where the hand is both the quintessence, it's about marriage, it's about the creative hand, it's about fire, and in fact, he uses them. I mean, this little arrangement here, well, that's a library up above a hearth, so there's this book up above the hearth, aligned with this horizon, that's actually a reservoir across the street, curiously replicated in Ronchamp, where that is the only consistent horizontal in the whole building. That thing is the door to, you remember the bright red chapel, so there's this red glow that comes out, set of steps that goes up to the book. The underside of that is gilded. The arrangement, the sort of laboratory problem, the arrangement between the studio and the chapel is part of the basic meaning of the building. And you probably remember the cycle that begins in the morning with the light going through the Virgin's, the little horizontal oculus where the Virgin is, into the church. And by the time it comes around the evening, this is his image from the Oeuvre Complète. It produces this bull shadow on the west wall. And he seems to, therefore, I mean, the iconography of Virgin Mary in this alchemical story isn't innocent either, but I'm just dropping that for the sake of this. But certainly one of the things he was involved with, the Pasiphae myth and the birth of the Minotaur. This seems, as a kind of section, the oculus is now dark, i.e. the sun's in the west, birth of the Minotaur, seems to replicate a number of the aspects of Ronchamp. So you begin to get an idea of the kind of way Le Corbusier is working with this. The taureau, of course, is this late image. I mean, he drew something like 16 or 17, and he stopped numbering them after a while. For a while, he religiously numbered each version. He spent something like 13 years working on the taureau stuff. And it's got this literal horizon down here, and this more metaphorical horizon, where that becomes like clouds with this kind of cosmic egg in it. There's several women's heads. There's moon iconography involving Vaughan. That's a set of noses. That's the nostrils as well as breasts. This hand features in the first version, but not in later versions. This is, in fact, Le Corbusier himself from a stone, and there's a whole cycle that moves from the lower world that eventually acquires 3 layers to this upper world, and seems to be a complete transformation of a long series that worked where this, like this one, this is its final version tipped up, where the reconciliation of opposites of architect and engineer is treated as a solar cycle with 7 stages, where that's the hand, and there's 7 layers in the hand, and the coincidence of opposites in relation to the hand, and so forth. Okay. And this leads to the second story behind the bull, where he claims that an image, he'd seen this painting sitting on its side, and he turned it into a bull. And of course, the bull is part of the whole metamorphic world that he's involved with. It's got solar implications. It's got kind of death and renewal implications. It's also part, particularly in its form as Minotaur, it's part man, part beast, part god. In other words, the whole structure of themes and metaphors recur in different regions of his activity as a designer, and with the aim of achieving some sort of synthetic understanding or representational milieu. So, for example, the primitive objects, the objects à réaction poétique, become a world of creatures and their relationships set in various forms of an arena bounded by the horizon, the basis of his architectural poetics and vision of renewal. And he refers to these kind of linear drawings as mariage de lignes, where it even includes, am I going to get this right? No? Not only the writing all over the building of something like Ronchamp, but as Kostrop has noticed, Corbusier's name in this kind of broken apart Negredo state in the lower left-hand side of the inside of the door at Ronchamp. And so as much as for Le Corbusier, there's this element of death, dissolutio. You don't quite know how metaphoric it is, whether he committed suicide, so on and so forth. The rebirth of the adept, and particularly there's all of this stuff as something relevant to design as a management of signs, like an alchemist, where you translate a lot of the world into signs about the world on which you then operate. Now, the background to something like the dog in this context, and we could go on for hours, and I'm just going to do this couple of images. You can see first in a fairly innocent but quite complex scene, which I'm not going to go through the whole of, in this little mutt here, who's part of the hunting scene, standing in front of the portal of death and so forth. Or in Mithras, he helps Mithras hunt down the solar bull, which provides for the fecundation of the world, with the sun and the moon would have been up here. The dog, the mythological dog has a huge range of types, Anubis, Cerberus, so on and so forth, but many of them related to death, and in particular, this business of being both companion and therefore part of our world, and something that communicates with another world, with a world that's beyond you, and this business of animals and gods and so forth. When Socrates swears by the dog, as he does often in the dialogues, one imagines that it's this kind of background to which he's referring. And obviously there's what generally we're dealing with is something like the shamanistic imagination of being able to move through levels of reality and keep the continuity. Now the question at the end of all of this is the nature and value of this sort of phenomenon. What are we dealing with? What kind of myths are we talking about? Is this just images? Or is this something that has a dimension of reality? Is it just processing signs? I think the question is most sharp at the level of the collective imagination. It clearly works for Le Corbusier. We've come to believe that an artist is free to choose, a boiled potato or Maoism I believe the rhizome is actually not boiled, but you get what I'm driving at. It's the uncooked version. There's obviously an attempt to understand, it moves in the region of the Jungian archetype and the world of comparative religions by Iliado, that, it sort of gives you a kind of image of all religions, but none in particular, and you don't quite know what this phenomenon is. He looked to Homer's Odyssey for guidance for the style of the poem and redrew the Iliad drawings by Flaxman. Most scholars agree with Turner that he saw himself in terms of something like one of Edouard Chouet's initiates, i.e., you probably know this funny book. It's actually got a whole succession that goes back into the 17th century, but that's the one he knew. Treating the life of Christ, Pythagoras, Socrates, various Indian figures, this vision of the leader, endowed with somewhat thaumaturgic powers, powers of healing, powers of leading, powers of insight. And he certainly, I mean, the whole motif of initiation was a big deal in late 19th century Hermetic thought. And it's something, of course, that's very important to Le Corbusier's Promenade Architecturale, so on and so forth. But no one seems to think that he intended the poem to be a new Iliad, although he does make this comment in one of the Cannae about, Greek culture being founded on a poem. And nobody either seems to look upon the little collection of figures of himself, his wife, his family, as some sort of holy family to the new dispensation. Moore and Kustrup seem to think he was a closet alchemist and astrologer. I'm willing to allow for a certain amount of superstition, but mostly I think we're in the presence of myth as a guide to poetics, which are in turn seen as a guide to reality. And he uses expressions like the algebra of the signs, and he makes little formulas, like a kind of proto-structuralist, equals cosmos, and things like this. Now what we're dealing with there is something that goes back to Romanticism. It's a variant on the kind of have it both ways proposition. That is to say, it's both open to individual choice and deeply meaningful, which, it happens so often, it isn't kind of thought of in those terms. It's actually an amusing kind of problem. Quite what level of communication is being intended here? This can only be achieved by translating the deep context, i.e. the world of which the myth used to be part. I mean, it's only really when you take a scholarly or cynical stance or skeptical stance towards myth that you speak of myth in general. Otherwise, you just have myths. By translating the deep context into motifs in iconography, which can be managed through knowledge. And it has to be said that a lot of his paintings, where Picasso went from painting people to doing still lifes, or stills life, Le Corbusier went in the other direction. He went from still lifes to painting people, and you can really see it. You constantly find yourself in this kind of milieu of decoding. He really doesn't have the sense of humor that people like Stravinsky, Joyce, Breton, a lot of his contemporaries does. The thing always wants to work, and there's as interesting as the paintings are, and why I think he really should be regarded as an architect, is that these things are, part of his private research, and they have this quality of knowledge, of being mappable, of being full of clues. For Le Corbusier, nature is that to which we must be reconciled, as well as the paradigm of the creative process and its metamorphoses. Now, this is a fairly conventional view, indebted in many of its details to the late symbolist culture in which he trained. Not, however, that this phenomenon is unimportant. Nature had come to occupy a peculiar centrality in the post-Enlightenment culture, divided between the claims of theory, the sciences, on the one hand, and analogy in the humanities on the other, roughly the difference between physis and physics. For the poets, nature was a source from which we'd become alienated, and soon developed into a complementarity between the aesthetic death of the sublime and the inner primitiveness of the essentially human. For the scientists, the investigation of nature required the effacement of personality. All associations, the laboratory was basically about making a clear territory for the experiment. For the noble discipline of adequating nature to mathematics. I use the word noble because it's a phrase that keeps turning up in the defense of science. If architecture is still thought of as healing some sort of wound or occupying some gap between techniques and aesthetics, It was in pursuit of that aim that Le Corbusier felt obliged to read nature in terms of a reciprocity of myths and laws, i.e. that whole milieu section at the top of the poem is basically a little group of myths that Le Corbusier invented in the 30s. And he presents it in a section called Laws in the Ville Radieuse, but everybody ignored it when it came out in the time. They were interested in, how to get it done. To investigate the milieu of alchemy as something halfway between religion, art, and contemporary science, and particularly to situate the whole problem with respect to the chthonic, as if to acknowledge some sort of crisis of embodiment. That is to say, you back off and really anchor yourself when things are getting terribly sophisticated or rich or overly theoretical. Works like Ronchamp and La Tourette commanded respect by a lot of people who had no idea about the iconographic context from which they came. And it's probably worth mentioning, I'm going to get this wrong, that even in Danny's piece, this motif of the chthonic as a way of holding on to where you can put your foot down and begin to address a difficult issue is something, this is only the model, and quite what that, at the moment, that's all concrete. And whether it's meant to be faced by something as light as this, I'm not sure. But certainly in principle, there is, and it's replicated in several points across the thing. On the one hand, there's this trajectory of lines that take on, of course, different characters, and the great series of voids that marches through them. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's been talked about being and non-being and cross-being and so forth, which of course they aren't. I mean, you can't sort of build an ontological proposition. I mean, they are, on the other hand, as indicative of the primary order and what's available to the primary order as something like the dome or vault would have been in, probably pre-Enlightenment culture. And the consistency, I'll come back to this in a moment. I just want to alert you to it as a phenomenon. Le Corbusier's architecture, people tried to copy his architecture just by direct reference to the works, inevitably ending up with a kind of weak copy. I mean, we all know what we're talking about. Boston Town Hall, for example. On the other hand, nobody took up his poetics. I mean, it's only recently that people have begun even looking at it. They didn't find that as anything worth getting bothered with, being inspired by, or anything like that. In part in the reasonable view that it was both second-hand and possibly second-rate, but also because originality demanded reinvention of the whole program, both myth and architecture. It's not worth getting into the problem of originality per se, because that's secondary to the conditions under which it's possible to believe in being original at this scale, i.e. you develop a whole kind of representational world. Certainly the notion of one's own myth is a contradiction in terms. Now, I'm going to do this next bit quite quickly. This is the Belvedere in Vienna, structured as a series, obviously as a series of rooms. And this is the first of the English gardens in Germany, a place called Wörlitz, done in about 1770 to 1773. Originally looked upon very favorably by Goethe, later he turned away from this kind of thing. But it's, I mean, one's immediate reaction just looking at these two images is that this thing, has all the favorite motifs of de-centeredness, and it's all oriented around water. I mean, he's created a bunch of islands out of what was, I mean, in fact, it wouldn't have even these boundaries because these are all neighbors' fields and other villas and so forth. The transition from the Baroque to the Enlightenment is more subtle and sometimes claimed, but it's in the interpretation of nature after the introduction of the English garden in Europe that the proposition of being able to manage representation in this way, i.e. put the whole thing together as a kind of representational understanding, becomes established practice. Already in the 18th century, people like the Abbé Delille were saying the old Baroque gardens are done by architects, the new ones by philosophers. The issue when you get into the literature on this stuff, and you keep running across this funny, obviously imitation of nature is one of the big motifs, but it gets connected to obedience and who is obeying whom and what the rightness of it is. That is to say, this is one of the places where we first begin to perceive clearly this confusion between the ethical and the moral. Now, Wurlitz had a lot of the motifs that the gardens that followed it had. You know, tunneled passages, little rochers. It had a temple of the night done with stained glass. You kind of walked around it and kept re-seeing things from different angles. After a period in which this kind of world got cultivated almost to levels of absurdity, you know, pyramids that were ice houses and this sort of thing, people began to develop a reaction, but it was a very strange one. I mean, somebody like Tieck actually caught the message of the Baroque garden quite well. A roomy green extension of the house encompassed by enchanting nature, governed by the same laws as men of understanding and reason, the laws of the inward unseen mathematics of life. The reference to unseen mathematics is not what the proponents of the English garden tried to make the issue, obedience as geometry. In other words, after the English garden, the Baroque garden is fatally globalized and turned into a picture that's a correlative to what the English garden is. The Baroque garden is the end of a sequence of interpretation of a mediating continuity and difference, of which the room, even in its perspectivized form, as you certainly see it there, is a key manifestation of the setting. I mean, the whole decorum of architecture, how you related to people, the way you were in the palace, was carried out into the garden. In the English garden, it's far more about individual contemplation. You know, the fetes go away, and there's a kind of didactic moment where the nature and history become the sort of generalized and kind of global embodiment in the garden. Now, in my view, the English garden marks the loss of the indirect interpretation and the correlative rise of the philosopher architect, best embodied by Schinkel. And I'm not going to spend a long time on Schinkel, but we do need a couple of points. Certainly his paintings, I mean, Schinkel is one of the, you know, he lives in a culture where everything is being done philosophically, and both Humboldts, Hegel, Goethe, the Schlegels, Schinkel himself. There's this incredible effort to, and after the kind of follies of of course the 7 Years' War and the Napoleonic Wars, blah blah blah, there's an attempt to regroup and say, look, it's a much more serious issue that we're involved with, and you. In Schinkel's paintings, you get this funny combination of pictorial convention and emotion, this fastidious archaeology and expression. They really embody the notion of culture as an idealized picture. And in his architecture, the perfected fragments are fastidiously coordinated. Am I going to get this right? Yeah, sorry, that was just Potsdam. I'm only interested in one piece. This is the Charlottenhof. This is the whole thing with the Charlottenhof here and the Garden of Memory and so on and so forth, going down to the pump house and meeting the gardener's house in this lake and island, which is what you're looking at. This is turned 90 degrees here, right? And there's the whole, on the one hand, it presents itself like a fragment of Poussin, part, you know, medieval, Tuscan medieval house, part Roman garden, i.e. is a kind of stratification of cultures. Barry Bergdahl tries to take this thing as a whole narrative architecture. I think it's quite possible that Schinkel translated the notion of architecture into something like what Bergdahl calls tectonics, about which I understand you're going to hear shortly. I'd be worried about that issue. But what you certainly get is this strange correlation between what it is as a picture and you know, there's a funny game of twos going on and threes and doubles, the split of the, I've cropped it off, but there's the king and queen are in separate idicula, one button to the back of the building, the other free. All along this wall is a series of arches, from the bower to relieving arches to drains. In other words, the whole representational exercise is a kind of continuum. Everything has got a reason. Everything is quite, you know, witty. I mean, a huge amount of intelligence. The perfected fragments are fastidiously coordinated with an exhaustive, and I would call it a geometry, whose comprehensive lineaments regulate the elements of architecture and nature with a scrupulous precision and imperious uniformity of his etching plates. A milieu of erudite visual reference manifest as a panorama of facts. It is a neurotic performance, an exercise in cultural discipline, intended to suppress any defect of cultural understanding or manners, which it therefore exhibits like someone trying to carefully conceal a guilty secret. In other words, the more reality is deemed susceptible to the synthesis or control of design, and this is something that begins to be worked on really with the conception of disegno in mannerism. The more reality is deemed susceptible to the synthesis or control of design, the more any error in design appears to carry the burden of general intellectual stupidity, lack of moral goodness, loss of cultural integrity, and so forth. In other words, the more ethics and history are made accountable to the obvious limitations of design, the more these limitations become the standard by which the enterprise itself shelters the evil and death it strives so hard to overcome. Conversely, error is more easy to achieve, since there appears to lie nothing between superficial solutions to specific problems and genius of either talent or extensive understanding, and preferably both. In other words, the issue, what I'm suggesting is the issue, as we understand it, is launched at this time. Certainly, the kind of discussions, the salon, the whole way that social, intellectual, and life of making circulated through each other to make the Berlin of Schinkel is something terribly familiar to us, even if the appearance is very different, except possibly in the case of people like Philip Johnson and so forth. The funny game that's going on in the English garden between the literalism of its nature and its role as picture bears it directly on its supposed capacity to sustain referential settings distant in place or history. When you get rid of symbols and you make them distant historically, you make them imminently distant, as it were, and call it, I mean, they basically shift from paradigms to models. This is less, the literalness of the earth is less of the nature that's represented, is less an effective embodiment of the conceptual character of the synthesis than it is itself a global generalization. In other words, what I'm suggesting is that not only it's very easy to understand what I'm suggesting about the architecture. I'm saying this too, this whole, you know, the immense amount of care. You can see some of what's going on at the very top of that, where it's both the turn and the wiggly line. You know, it's both, fictive donkey tracks and something highly, you know, a kind of latent geometry lying under it. You know, the care with which even it's rendered. I mean, this is almost scary, if not directly kitsch. The confusion of tangibility and intellectual accountability in lieu of the concrete is one of those confusions that's still around in large measure. With a Baroque garden is a deep articulation in the sphere of ornament, of the primary situation of a room. This use of the English garden betrays an anxiety concerning the interrelatedness of its parts that's shared by the architecture. The global character of the world it invents presents itself as new with respect to what preceded it. It presents this newness as a combination of a different appearance and a transparency to knowledge. Henceforth, all innovations will have this character, and the garden remains basically English. By henceforth, I mean for the next, 200 years. So, for example, if we look at, now I could go, I pulled at the last moment for time things like Ledoux, Tony Garnier, Le Corbusier's cities. I mean, you've been through that kind of movie before. But I do want to point out, simply in something like the Mies House, quite the role of the earth. First of all, the difference between the thing in plan and elevation. And, in the elevation, it's this kind of thick horizon, almost a cave. And it looks like, I mean, he gave you a vanilla and chocolate version. I think one has to do with light, and the other has to do with earth, and trying to find the primary level at which what presents itself in plan is a completely different world. Part decentered, part constitutive of center. The house has had a long period of becoming semi-sacred in the most lugubrious way. And this kind of four-quartered split, deconstituted, constitutive world is a kind of universal program played out at the scale of a house. But what the ground is essentially background, in the way that the English garden is background to that, to the performance. I mean, they complement each other. It's not a void in the way that it looks, just a blank sheet of paper. It's that a kind of latent nature that has been brought into the conceptual structure as a whole. And of course, La Villette, despite episodes of this kind, is most firmly laid out on the English garden. Now, in view of the moment of didacticism, the reciprocity between design and meaning, or what people used to call idea and appearance, to the monument needs to be stressed. And I'm choosing one of the biggest. For reasons that have to do, that are perhaps slightly surprising. This is, of course, the Vittorio Emanuele in Rome. And, all right, so they reunified Italy, and admittedly most of Europe is involved with this bizarre phenomenon, nationalism. And they say, right, Rome is ours. We have this huge cultural heritage that we've got to live up to. This, of course, is done in the 30s. What I'm really after is this thing. And so, center of Rome, right at the head of the old Roman Forum, capital line behind it. What do? One would think something like a political space. A world where, Italy would come together. No. What you do is this. This great magic white mountain, obviously derived from Praeneste. There was a lugubrious competition before this, in which, huge marble pagodas were proposed and all kinds of things. But things like this were the main thing. And it has Vittorio Emanuele, the first king, on that horse, which, of course, I think you've heard me say before, is big enough to have. When they got finished casting it, the workers had a dinner in it with a set table. And the thing is this massive mountain that produces a panorama of the habitatio of Rome, the inside of which is a war museum. Now, the unknown soldier who is celebrated there was actually installed finally by the fascists, who had this brilliant ceremony up in northeastern Italy after the First World War, where they got 11 unknowns and laid them across in front of the high altar in Aquileia, and had a mother, an unknown mother, choose the ignoto who would rest in here, and the others were all buried in a common grave. What resides in the back of that, i.e. in here, is a huge vaulted room about 8 meters high, with clerestory lighting, through which you go to get to the chapel, which is actually facing the other way. As I say, it was done in the fascist period. And all along that room are lecterns about this high, double-backed lecterns. And on the lecterns are books, and in the books are the names of all the people who have fallen for Italy. And it goes the whole length of that. And underneath that is a war museum. Now, first of all, the mountain itself, it is massive but white. It's this kind of great chunk of material on huge brick foundations, manifest as light. Second of all, it's this lateral ascent through the arts and through all of civilization. It's a space of, it's an object of contemplation. The whole city is a kind of background and is the complement to This is incidentally a postcard that I just really love the tulips sort of being squeezed out of the ground by the weight of this thing. Drops of blood. This moment of individual death is, there's a kind of hiatus between your own death as an unknown, as somebody dying for your country, and the mass of all Italians, and of course both the Risorgimento, who were responsible for this, and fascism, shared that kind of cult of the fallen hero. Now, there's several things in that notion of monument that interest me. One is its relation to history, and particularly the notion of individual freedom as a moment of death, of suffering, of potential alienation, as much as, because there is so little between the individual and the whole. And secondly, that the way it attempts to appropriate the whole representational structure. It takes by seeking to be a self-involved embodiment of an idea, or one has to be more clear about this. It's not really an idea, it's a concept more. It detaches itself from the process of meaning, which for its background. In other words, the more it works, the more it's isolated. The more it's part of the background, the less it's a monument. And the particular things that it's monumentalizing, the isolation in history, the idea that you are making history through your sacrifice, all of these sorts of, it's like you're trapped in a history that you have to make. And for that, you can only live that way as a concept. Now, that's slightly puzzling, and I'll pull it together when we get to the end of this. But clearly, what this has as its background is the problem of space, because it's only that you can navigate in this way, as a kind of huge generalization from the particular to the general rather than the universal, as something that is transparent to knowledge and feeling. The world had never been put together like that before. Certainly as late as Borromini, he uses space just to mean the interval between two balusters. It doesn't have that generalization that it does for us. And certainly as it becomes a problem of freedom, and here we have, of course, my favorite slide of freedom, the new culture as athletes. I mean, admittedly, they aren't dressed the way our athletes would be dressed, lycra, board blind or whatever it's called. In this kind of axonometric space with these, benign little businessmen or townsmen kind of watching, oh, look at the young are up to. Certainly the post-18th century conception of freedom and its emphasis on individual, or something like individual rights, is very different from the Greek conception of freedom, and is easily fed by things like the free market, things like a political system in which the whole is never specified, in which all the conditions by which you have this freedom are left mysterious. In other words, what I'm suggesting is the conception of the monument, the conception of space, this conception of freedom, and a lot of the things that we sort of take as our necessary context are all part of a larger problem of disorientation. Partial orientation is probably better, because certainly we're not completely lost. But it has the way they have their character is what I'm ultimately after, and particularly how the problem of what the research of somebody like Le Corbusier, what he's hunting for, the motif of the hunt, the motifs of death and survival that characterize his work, that characterize that stuff, where that's all coming from, why you latch on to the primitive. Yeah, we don't have time to deal with that. What happened in architectural discourse is quite interesting. From the explicit theories of people like Choisy and Guadet, you go to the manifesto, which is, you don't quite know what it is. I mean, Le Corbusier says, look what's wrong with Europe. My architecture can cure it. How did he get from one to the other? By way of the car and the Parthenon? I mean, you actually, the deeper you get into it, you realize quite what's going on. And there's a deep mystical element to a lot of this in both Kandinsky, Van Doesburg, Kahn, Corb. i.e. there's this funny underground world where the synthesis is taking place against all the pretensions to a very irrational species of rationalism. I mean, the Taiga dialogue with Le Corbusier, where he says all of your golden section stuff is silly. I mean, you just can't figure out who's on top in that game. You know, who's being more, you know, as it were, concrete or realistic, and who's being more honest, or quite what's happening in that kind of confusion. Now, what's happened subsequently from things like the manifesto, or what I call bridging discourses, because you can't quite tell what they're putting together, is the world of the post-war university. I mean, what's really happened since World War II is that architecture, as a debate certainly, has become situated in its schools. And the question certainly must be asked, can we say that all the writing and talk since the war, more than the whole previous history of architecture, has attained any greater depth of understanding or led to better architecture, or more to the point, prevented bad architecture? Certainly Joan Occam's collection is not a very edifying, just realized how bad that pun was, testament to the profundity or wit of the discipline, and poignantly ends with Tafuri's despair, recurrent motifs of newness, formalism, taking the part for the whole, which is not to be confused with the great diversity that the discipline has taken up. Is this not a case of shut up and draw? Well, Venturi made the point way back in '63 that one should concentrate on the concrete particulars of architecture rather than the abstract theories about it. I mean, already people are getting fed up with this regime. The difficulty is, of course, quite what the concentrating on the concrete particulars means. You know, there are people, you know, whose work you genuinely respect, like Leverance and Peter Salter, who really do their work through the architecture, as against Venturi, who talks too much. On the other hand, there's thousands of architects who don't talk, and look where they are. The notion of just doing the job is a hugely conceptual enterprise. You know, being a professional itself creates a hiatus between one's life as a citizen and one's life as an architect. And so that it isn't obviously that simple. Similarly, the whole world of popular culture, I was going to get into that. I don't think we need to worry about that. And I think what I'm going to do is I was going to go into the various forms of architectural research, but I think I'll skip that as well. I'll just finish. The whole collection of styles of thought that I'll just list some of them. Obviously, the ones that things like the university research councils are after: science, sociology, blah blah blah, art history, psychology, and particularly philosophy. This whole collection of styles of thought was brought to bear on what was generally understood to be the naive and overly dogmatic inheritance from early modernism, i.e. what we saw from Le Corbusier. Originally intended to refine and deepen this inheritance. I mean, I certainly remember that was my experience at school. I mean, I had come from Joyce and people like that, and I got into architecture. I just couldn't believe what I was dealing with. I mean, people told me to make form, make space. And, you know, trying to make space, what am I doing? You know, how does this get to a town? Anyway. Originally intended to refine and deepen this inheritance, i.e. there was quite a bit of respect for what early modernism had achieved, and despite efforts to the contrary, it generally displays the divisions between specialist discourse of the university context from which it arose, i.e. it refined stuff like Le Corbusier out of existence. You know, it was really easy for a Panofsky to tear apart Le Corbusier. It was really easy for a philosopher to say, look, this guy doesn't know anything. And of course, Le Corbusier has always been a bit of an embarrassment to university architecture departments because, you know, he's an autodidact. And he kept saying how foolish the academics were, and you know what he means. You know, it's people like me. Moreover, in any particular context, in any particular architect, this kind of material, this sort of free-floating mythic material, this world of illusions, allusions. I mean, certainly by the time you got through with Tafuri, who really got naughtiness into a level of evil fairly quickly, you were dealing with the possibility that architecture was nothing but a kind of perpetuum mobile of iconographic management as a kind of world of signs. It could be sort of emphasized either way according to your personality, talents, or opportunities. In any particular architect, this kind of cultural material, let's call it that, tends to take on a pick and choose quality, selected according to personal intuition or design procedure. To be sure, what architects do best is design, and the involvement in research is taken as a kind of likely or most prevalent available option for dealing with two problems: a perceived inadequacy in present designs, always leaving a little bit of room in that for the quest for originality, and a disorientation with respect to the status of architecture in the culture, both as a body of work and as a discipline which ought to enjoy greater respect than it does. Among the consequences of this activity was a shift in schools of architecture away from teaching design as training to using design as a vehicle of speculation or research, something that probably has its roots in the Bauhaus, but certainly Cooper, Milan students were being published in Contraspazio, and of course, most famous of all to us, the AA, as examples of that. Now, in this, it tends to take place as a double effort to discover both the nature of architecture and to preserve the designer's place in it, i.e. we're not far off the kind of world that was just being talked about. One can understand the latter concern in the face of the increasing claims of the building industry, for whose benefit the government conception of research seems to be designed. Architecture, however, is more like politics than a science, more rooted in intensive understanding, the judgments and wisdom of praxis. It is not helped by being regarded either a weak version of the extensive understanding, i.e. as fuzzy engineering or something like that, or some species of emancipation from praxis through personal poetics, where one's own private artistic motifs become the equal but opposite of the scientific emancipation. And interestingly, the use of the word experiment in both contexts tends to suggest that something like this is possibly happening. Most importantly, the central questions become obscured. The AA in the creative period of the late 70s, early 80s was deeply involved in the city from several complementary points of view. This was not constituted as organized research with its integrity and methodological considerations, but more as a reflective dimension of the urban conditions of which it was part, i.e. the AA. In this sense, it was among the political possibilities of the town, but conversely, the town constituted the limits of possible speculations. There's some doubt that schools of architecture can or should enjoy the credibility that they once held, but the texture and depth of the urban order ought to be something intrinsic to design and its discourse. And now to try to illuminate that little mysterious sentence, I want to just pull a piece out of history before, right at the boundary, when it became possible, the ideal city is basically an imminent version of heavenly Jerusalem. It's accorded to history and human possibilities. It's basically when the town is believed to be open to reconstituting its order through design. Before particularly good and evil were made hostage to right and wrong. Now what this is, of course, is the Sala dei Nove in Siena. There's several councils that govern Siena, and this one is made up actually of all of merchants, but it was one of the most senior. There was 9 because Siena was divided into thirds. I'm not going to go through the whole arrangement, but the room is a small room in the back of the Palazzo Pubblico. So this window here, where that light's coming from, faces south. This is north, that's east, and that's west. And there's basically 3 very famous frescoes: bad government, good government, and the town and country, because of course the contrade were both related to the town, and one's life is both part of the country and part of the town, and they established again this mystical number 3, they established their radius of government at a 30-mile radius. Now, there's some discussion as to how you came in first, whether you went through the main council room or not, but certainly this is the west wall, the evil, this is the north, and that is the town. So the sun comes in, hits this, and moves across that, i.e. contrary to obviously because of the window, contrary to the actual movement of the sun. In other words, the 9 are governing in this context that gives evil its place. i.e. the evil and the good are simply presented beside each other in respect of the town. Now at this point the town is becoming kind of emancipated and presented as presentable as a kind of theater, as a theater of life. And the levels at which each of these are in part portraits, in part symbols, in part portraits, in part symbols, in part an actual room, and in part the background for the Nove, who probably sat like this and had their decisions and judgments in front. Nobody's quite sure. You can see what's going on. There's a kind of, much like this room, there's a world in which we're having a kind of discussion, although I'm doing it all at the moment. And then there's a background, the rest of the room. Things like your chairs are probably more new or more short-term than things like the floor, which are more long-term. I.e., there's a basic situatedness to a room of this kind that is very much about being taken for granted, that's being brought into a more explicit and articulate dimension, but still caught up in the world of which it's part. I mean, it's not trying to make sort of pure goodness. I mean, certainly the medieval city wasn't purely good. If anything, it was more violent than, I mean, unfortunately, topical topic at the moment, by which I don't, well, I suppose take it or leave it. But what I'm getting at is the kind of trying to give a sense of structure to the background that this sort of operation represents. It's almost the opposite of something like the monument. It is the first stage leading to that, to something like the monument. What it's part of is part of a larger idea that in Latin is called renovatio urbis, and it gets translated into English as urban renewal, and they couldn't be more different. And we don't have time to go through renovatio. We'll do some of that in the seminar, but roughly what happens is it has, for example, a very different, it's both an attitude to interpretation and an attitude to history. As an attitude to history, it seeks to restore the same in evolving historical conditions, as opposed to seeking to find the new. Now what the same is, think of it as a capital S, is really a set of primordial values, which are themselves open to reinterpretation. The paradigm in this case, in this sequence, particularly in Europe, of course, is Rome. And the first renovatio is that under Augustus, with Virgil, so on and so forth. You can then go to Augustine, which was or perhaps Constantine, then Augustine, and certainly Augustine's version of the relation of heavenly and earthly city was the point of departure for all subsequent notions of renovatio, both in Rome and in the cities which renewed themselves in the name of Rome. As an attitude to interpretation, it is indirect rather than direct. In other words, there's a discourse that pertains to the good, and then there's the actual decisions that you make. New defense works, a festival, a new poem, new buildings, new roads, reform of market, reform of the law. All of these things are, first part of the practical life. The practical life, in turn, is embodied as something that's understood to be distant from it, but you don't you can't really control. In other words, this and this aren't made into one thing, which is what's most obviously achieved in the utopias. Now, whoops. I just wanted to contrast that to this vision of government, where it's taken directly out of the town, and in these strange primordial buildings is set in this extraordinary empty landscape, mediated by, it's a very beautiful thing. I know it's hot as hell and and you can't get to see any of it, but there's the level of richness of it and all of that kind of thing seems to me to enjoy a rightful credibility, whatever else is wrong with it. On the other hand, what most intrigues me, though, is that how you would come up with this as a conception of government, as a kind of, it's like going directly back to, I mean, obviously it's the English garden and conceptual artifact or conceptual regime problem as part of that history, but that you would take yourself completely out of the town, and it's not something local to Chandigarh. Something like the Ladue Salt Works look in this world, as does Washington, D.C., But certainly in this period, Senyat Salo, which you normally, I mean, he's usually seen to be cozy. Brasilia, Dhaka. There's this kind of weird distancing in order to make an object out of the government itself and to root it in the land directly through this primordial architecture that with, lots of richness, lots of meaning. Right. I, of course, have played a double game with you in that my use of Lorenzetti is a product of, the kind of research that one might do in a university. In fact, it was something I did a long time ago, not in a university, but it's the kind of thing that, that doesn't matter. If we put that along with the Le Corbusier dog, along with, the whole range of kinds of research that are on offer, particularly in a place as fecund as this, and we begin to look to questions that are deeper about the context and how where the architect's place is, what this kind of background thinking amounts to. I mean, Le Corbusier is one of the few people, as busy as he was, who spent half the day in his studio drawing and painting and writing, and the other half of the day in the atelier. Half the people in the office thought this was terrific. The other half thought this was terrible, as you can imagine. Very few people get away with that today. To a certain extent, teaching is meant to be the equivalent. It raises much deeper questions of how in control of what, of how much, where ultimately is the essence of, if the architecture is fundamentally background in some sense, do you appropriate that? At what extent can you deliberately leave it, as it were? Questions of this kind. If this is a very conceptualized nature, very primordial nature, is there another nature that is so taken for granted that it's an overgeneralization, it's meaningless? Now this is a series of questions that simply can't be resolved in one setting, but I would like to offer that the problem of culture is less likely to involve specifiable goods or projects than it is a more open process depending upon moral courage and depth of understanding, and that the first step towards such a more open process is to detach the discourse pertaining to concrete action or morals from that pertaining to the good or ethics. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry. If anybody has a question, I'm happy to say no, yes, add beer and put it 6. It's fine. I've gone over. We started late. I'm only 10 minutes over.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In your very last sentence, you talked about moral courage. I was expecting you to say ethical courage.
Well, moral courage is that which is, I suppose you're right, it is ultimately an ethical courage, but moral courage is that which pertains to, what one's doing and this kind of thing.
Right.
Whereas the ethical, I mean, it's basically understanding is almost like ontology.
Right.
And morals is actually what you do, but splitting those two, not trying to make them. I mean, I think there was a long section in there, for example, on, not a long section, but a short section on the early misunderstandings of phenomenology, where it was, people like Norberg Schultz tried to turn it into something about, it was a program for design which Lou Kahn amply fulfilled, which is absurd, it's just missing the point completely. And it's part of that kind of issue. There's other things trying to deal with post-structuralism and so forth that probably were best left out because they were too quickly done. But I would like to get that debate going, if it's still alive. If everybody's given up, I'm happy to go along with that.
I don't really think that they have. I mean, that's what embarrasses me about the lectures that I do in Cambridge, because I do try and explain what post-structuralism might be about.
This is £20,000 or something, isn't it? Can I shut it off? Is that a switch?